Welcome to Money Talk Viewpoint. I'm Chantel Leeson. Successful businesses have one thing in common, is that they know how to market to the right people with the right message at the right time. And that is what we do through our podcast talk show, is get you in front of the right people. Well, with that being said, I want to introduce our guest speaker on our panel for today. Our guest speaker is Mary Elaine Petrucci, and Jonathan and Katie Pfister will be a part of our audience co-hosting, and my co-host is Dennis Williams. Mary, how are you?
I'm great, Chantel. My topic that the three of us will be talking about is communication. And what I do is help busy, frazzled executives who are juggling family, work, and caring for a loved one to achieve a better balance and achieve the success that they desire.
Mary, do you align yourself with employers, or how do you get into are you able to get into small businesses to discuss the kind of programs that you have available? And I'll tell you the reason for asking that. Mm-hmm. By the time they need it, it's probably way too far. I think that a lot of times, if we implement programs in the workplace that employees can take advantage of, an employee who's in their late 40s or early 50s probably have parents who are reaching that phase of life. And rather than wait till their parents are past that and already into the long-term care need or caregiving need, train people ahead of time so they can understand what would be some triggering factors they can acknowledge that to let them know maybe we need to get some kind of training. Dennis, I see you scratching your head. I know you have something to say.
Well, this time I just had an itch. Although I can't,
Dennis.
there is one item that Jonathan actually touched on that that most people do not think about, and that is there's a higher probability of disability than there is of death. And in that context, everyone thinks in terms of the replacement of income, but they forget, depending upon what the injury is, it may have a direct impact on the individual's ability to continue activities of daily living, especially if you're dealing with issues of head trauma. So people tend to only think about long-term care and communication in the context of somebody who is aging. But these issues also occur considerably younger. And again, there's a higher probability of these incidents, more so than dying, which of course demands, as it should, life insurance coverage. And so to Jonathan's point, beginning to look at long-term care in your 40s and 50s for yourself is extremely important, because the cost is dramatically less, for one thing. And so I think that's something that people do need to kind of consciously think about. The other thing I was going to also add, again, when it comes back to communication, is one of the biggest challenges is getting the person who has lost control the willingness to let go of that control, so that there's not a crisis. And unfortunately, usually what happens is things happen in crisis. So you're having to scurry around dealing with something. And again, coming back to communication, you got all kind of gaps that are happening because the family member is trying to live life. And all of a sudden, this crisis is tossed on them that disrupts life. And when you're dealing with disruption, you don't usually do well with your communication in that environment. And so, I think from that perspective, I think that's the other dimension that I think Jonathan and Katie were touching on just briefly when they're sitting down at dining room tables and dealing with issues, and how you integrate the communication with a viable solution that you can actually act on.
There's a factor.
Can I jump in real quick?
I'm going to say one statement about this, and that is having trust with family members, because You
Right.
have family members, but there's no trust. If there's no trust, there's not much you can do. Just having a trusted conversation, I think that's what you mean by sitting at the dinner table. Let me turn to Katie because I'm gonna let her talk about. Go ahead, Katie.
So this is also from my personal experience, and I love what Dennis said, how this all ties together. So my stepdad had an incident with work, and they didn't know at the time that he did have a disease, an underlying disease that was rearing its ugly head at that time. But what it caused was he was a truck driver delivering food to restaurants, and so it actually caused him to become disabled, and things that my mom hadn't even thought about. She's real good about the insurance, so he had life insurance. But disability, usually through your work, only covers you, and it's not for much. It's not going to replace your paycheck completely for a short period of time. So now, not only did they have those financial stresses, because he needed help with his disease, but wasn't bringing in as much money, and they still had the regular bills to pay. And that caused so many communication issues for the government. It took them 2 years to go through the whole disability process. So there's still that gap between losing that disability from his workplace and the government actually finally qualifying him as disabled. So, you know, that was minimally just a 2-year process there before he had to go through additional treatment. So there's so many things that we don't think about, and that hit him in his 40s. So it can happen at any age. It's not necessarily as you're getting older.
Wow.
Well, and that's true. I have worked with clients who may have fallen like down the stairs at work in the stairwell, and they're not able to work anymore because of just the head trauma, the light sensitivities, the sound sensitivities, and everything else that you have to deal with when you have a head injury. So I agree with everyone. I think those family conversations need to start early. And I know it's hard with people in the baby boomer generation because they really want to feel independent and want to hold onto their independence for as long as possible. I know for a fact my parents really wanted to be at home, and that was great. It did entail a lot of, 24/7 care that they had to pay out of pocket because they didn't, they had like all the medical insurance and legal documentation. They just didn't have like a long-term care policy, or any other insurance product that could have helped them at that point.
Americans are living longer now, longer than ever, right? And one of the things I talked about earlier was these, I don't know what the time frame specifically, but let's say early 2000s, there was over 100 long-term care companies out there doing policies. And then in the teens, at some point, we're down to 15 or 10. And that's because they were building this off of life insurance. It wasn't built for long-term care or use, continual use of not just 2, 3, 4 years, but 5, 6, 7, 8 years, right? People are lingering on. So it's something to continuously think about. Just want to touch on. And then the other thing you said, a fall. I don't know how many times I said it to our clients, but a fall will change your life, man. Well, it doesn't matter how old you are, whether you can't walk as well, you need a new hip, then that's the whole thing, and then that can get infected. It's a terrible rabbit hole that we're not going to go down. But yeah, fall is just detrimental.
It all goes back to that communication thing, doesn't it?
Right, it does. I think communication with family members is really critical, and finding ways to bring up sensitive topics like insurance and legal and medical insurance needs to be discussed. I think that every family is different, so you have to take into account everybody's personality and how the way that they perceive things. And I think conversations need to start early so that before there's a crisis that occurs, because it usually does happen when somebody has a life-changing event, whether it's a fall or some progressive disease like dementia. So it's so important to have like all those pieces in place as early as possible.
We've got about 10 minutes left. I want to cover something on the other end. We've talked about proactive thinking. Let's talk about some reactive things, because not everything is positive. And Dennis, Katie and Jonathan, you and I talked about this in the previous meeting. What happens? Let's talk about what happens when it's not a positive family relationship, or when the kids are trying to go after the parents' money, or when they're trying to access things from an account or an insurance policy. Give me some feedback, your experiences with that.
Talk about.
I've had multiple experiences, both in the Medicare business and working in an accounting office. A lot of it comes down to legal. And so people didn't prepare with the power of attorney, or they didn't write stuff a certain way in a will or trust. So you have to be really wise with who you're making your power of attorney, because we have seen people who did actually have a power of attorney. But unfortunately, the person they chose, like, they may have been great at the time, but those dollar signs are flashing in front of them, and they start thinking about how they can preserve their own wealth, looking at it from their perspective of like, well, this is my money, so I want to make it last for me. And I have seen where sometimes it neglects the elderly. And there is, just like we've heard of DCFS, oftentimes people think of younger children, but there is elderly abuse as well. So people can report that, but it gets really ugly when things come down to what's legal. And we've seen it where the power of attorney was legally able to do things because they had that, right? And it made it really difficult because we knew that the client wasn't in the best situation.
You hit a real raw nerve for me, Katie, when you bring this up, because I've seen it happen repeatedly. And there are two types of long-term care policies. Well, actually, let's go backwards. The issue of a power of attorney. I was fortunate. I was the power of attorney for my parents. But one of the things that happened when it triggered was, now the question becomes, what happens if something happens to me? I had a mother with Alzheimer's. And so, of course, people tell me I should never say this, but I do it anyway. I say, if I get hit by a truck tomorrow, who's taking care of mom? Mm-hmm. And there is no clear-cut answer, especially if there are other members in the family who are not the best at caregiving. So that's where a trust comes into place in order to potentially provide that protection. But the other issue that you pointed up is that, everybody loves the idea of what's called an indemnity policy, in which you get the money if it triggers. But people don't think about the current prevalence of Alzheimer's and dementia, that you may not be of sound mind to be able to make sure that the dollars are being spent appropriately. And you may not have a relative who is acting with integrity as relates to what they're going to charge to take those dollars. So I'm sure two of you have seen that before. And nobody ever thinks of these things that'll ever happen to them, versus if you have a reimbursement policy, you've got somebody to kind of put up some barriers to make sure that those protections are in place, so that the beneficiary the insured is not being taken advantage of. But beauty of an indemnity policy, of course, is it sold on having the freedom to do what you want. But it's frequently not pointed out that if you're going down that road, then you really need to have some backstops to make sure that the person who has access to the dollars is going to spend them accordingly. And I've seen that just too many times, of family members taking advantage.
That thing you said earlier about crisis mode because something happened, and what Chantel's talking about is what's the experience? What something happens once, there's no plan in place, and this is happening. What do you do? And who's there to help you, right? And those are, I feel that we see that a heck of a lot more than we see it here. I'm well prepared. Here's a binder of everything, and here's all my accounts and my passwords, and here's everybody that's on that. That's great. That's 1 out of 10 of every client we see, if we're lucky. Yeah, less. It's really about what do we do when we come up across somebody who we're finding that maybe they're not being abused, maybe they don't know, and things of that sort. So, uh, we hope, trust. We talked about that earlier, finding somebody you trust, and as fiduciaries and what we do to try to help everybody in the best interest. We hope and we wish there were more people out there like us doing what we're doing, and we see it from time to time. But just like any other family member, they see those dollar signs flashing, people change, and and the other thing, updating the trusts. Update your trusts from 20 years ago, 30 years ago. There might be new grandkids in the picture. Someone might not be around anymore. Free planning is the best, but what do we do when that's not the case anymore? There's always something to do if we discover, whether that's state help, policy help, guaranteed issue things. Maybe there's a pool of money here that needs to be utilized, and then what's that look like, and how much of that could go before you go in the state. And so hopefully my advice would be find Katie or John or someone like us, so we can help navigate that with you, become your partners in that, and putting that good out there in that world.
I know it's
Not someone like us.
The financial advisor, I did a written document, a written deliverable. And part of my process was that every single year, every single client who had a plan had to meet with me. But I didn't just meet with them. My practice at the time was comparable to what I do now, which is family office. As family office is a consortium of people that work together. I met with their attorney, their accountant, whoever was the person in their family they trusted. And we would go through all the people that were involved, and we did it on an annual basis. It was required for all of my clients, but I charged a retainer fee for that service. And now that I'm in the family office segment, that's just what the family office segment does. I want to cover one other thing too, and that is that I've watched this when the client wasn't my client. I watched where they had a power of attorney. The client had gotten ill. The daughter had the power of attorney, and the daughter, when the father was in the hospital, they thought it was worse than what they thought. But what happened was he recovered. But in the meantime, the daughter had unraveled a lot of material, financial instruments of the father. So that does happen. I think we're trying to address in this segment is that, and we're going to have another segment next week. So this is a little ongoing series here. Talk about the critical issues people face and thinking through the process of what you would want to have in place for yourself and for family members. It doesn't happen it's not a guarantee, but if it should happen, who's going to take care of what? Dennis, looks like you're about to say something.
Well, I just want to bring it back to Mary and communication again. And I was going to ask her one other question, and that is, if you think about these communication gaps, which are the ones that are the most, what's the word I want, destructive in getting through to solutions? How would you prioritize them? Which of the gaps do you find to be the absolutely most destructive in getting through to moving a family in the right direction when we're dealing with healthcare issues?
That's a great question. I think just going in with your own preconceived notion of what you think the person needs and or wants,